The backyard was bathed in the soft gold of a setting sun, the kind of light that made everything seem suspended in time. Smoke curled lazily from the grill, carrying the scent of charred meat and sweet corn. Kids squealed as they chased each other barefoot across the damp grass, their laughter ringing out against the low hum of conversation and clinking glasses. For a moment, it almost felt like we were a real family again, like the fractures and grudges of the past had been smoothed over by time and stubborn hope. I stood off to the side, a paper plate in my hand, watching it all unfold with a strange mix of contentment and distance. These gatherings had grown rarer over the years, harder to arrange as schedules hardened and old wounds festered just beneath polite smiles. But today, somehow, it all seemed easy, natural. The air smelled of grilled peaches and cut grass, and I let myself believe, for a little while, that maybe we were healing. My sister Rachel laughed too loudly at something her husband said by the fire pit. I caught a glimpse of his profile. Tom, with his ever-present smirk and restless energy. He looked good on the surface, like the kind of man who could anchor a family, but even from a distance, I felt the ripple of something off. I shook the thought away. This was not the day for second-guessing. Inside the house, the old hardwood creaked under my sandals as I made my way to the guest bedroom upstairs. I needed to put my purse somewhere safe. Not because I didn't trust anyone, I told myself, but because it was habit. In my line of work, you learn to be cautious without even thinking about it. I tucked it under a pile of jackets on the bed, out of sight but not locked away. As I turned to leave, a small chill brushed the back of my neck, like a breath I couldn't hear. I paused, my hand lingering on the doorknob. Something told me to stay, to check again, to listen harder to that whispering doubt. Instead, I smiled to myself, forced and hollow, and pulled the door shut behind me. Downstairs, the clink of ice in glasses and the low beat of music wrapped around me like a blanket. Someone handed me a beer. Someone else teased me about still being single. I laughed on cue, my body moving through the familiar dance of family dynamics. My heart, though, stayed somewhere upstairs, where a small black purse sat alone among strangers' coats, hidden but not safe. Later, I would look back at this moment, the easy laughter, the warm air, the sunset so perfect it hurt to remember, and realize it was the last time I allowed myself to believe everything was fine. That fleeting feeling of belonging would be the first thing stolen from me that night. And just like the cash tucked inside that purse, once it was gone, it was never coming back. The longer the evening stretched, the heavier the air seemed to grow. At first, I told myself it was just the heat, the lingering summer humidity clinging to our skin like invisible hands. But soon, the shift became harder to ignore. It showed itself in small, almost invisible ways. The way conversations paused just a second too long when I approached, how Rachel's smile tightened around the edges when she introduced me to new faces, as if there were some unspoken joke. She wasn't quite brave enough to tell out loud. During dinner, plates crowded the patio table, heavy with barbecue and potato salad, but the weight pressing on my chest had nothing to do with the food. I laughed along with everyone else, the sound brittle in my own ears, pretending not to notice when Tom made a crack about my little side project, the business I'd poured the last 3 years of my life into. His voice was light, teasing, but the glint in his eyes said more than the words did. Rachel chuckled too, a little too forcefully, not meeting my gaze. I pushed the food around my plate, the smell of smoked meat turning sour in my nose. Maybe it was harmless, maybe it was just family being family, sharp elbows and sharper tongues. That's what I told myself as I lifted my glass and toasted nothing in particular, feeling the carbonation burn my throat more than usual. But, deep down, a familiar unease was stirring, coiling slow and tight in the pit of my stomach. Later, when I mentioned in passing how well the business was doing, a small, proud moment shared without expectation, Tom's laugh burst out too loud, too sharp. Heads turned. Someone muttered, "Good for you," in a tone that sounded suspiciously like pity. I smiled, the way you smile when you're alone in a room full of people, and changed the subject before my voice could betray me. There was a moment, standing by the fire pit, where I caught Tom whispering something to Rachel. She glanced over, her shoulder at me, and for a heartbeat, her face twisted into something raw. Not cruelty exactly, but something close. Pity, maybe, or guilt. The sky deepened into purple and navy as the night wore on. Someone lit sparklers for the kids. The light flickered against smiling faces, against the dull gleam of my sister's wedding band as she clutched Tom's arm a little too tightly. I watched it all from the edges, the laughter and easy intimacy that now felt closed off, like a room I could see into but no longer enter. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was tired, that my own walls were too high. I told myself a lot of things, trying to push back the rising certainty that something had shifted tonight, and not in my favor. Morning light poured through the guest bedroom window, soft and pale, casting long slants across the worn wooden floor. I moved slowly, savoring the last few moments of quiet before heading home. The house felt different in the morning, emptier somehow. The laughter and noise from the night before had evaporated, leaving only the hollow sounds of distant clattering dishes and the occasional muffled conversation downstairs. I knelt by the bed, brushing aside the pile of jackets I'd tucked my purse under the night before. My fingers found the familiar shape easily, the worn leather warm against my hand. I unzipped it out of habit, the motion as natural as breathing. That's when my heart stumbled. The envelope was gone. I blinked hard, willing it to reappear, padding, down every pocket, every crevice of the bag. I dumped everything out onto the bedspread: keys, lip balm, a crumpled receipt, a half-eaten granola bar. But no thick envelope, no comforting weight of neatly folded bills. I stood up too fast, the blood rushing from my head. Maybe I had left it somewhere else. Maybe I'd been careless, distracted by the easy lull of family and food. I retraced my steps, the closet, under the bed, even behind the dresser, my hands moving faster, more frantically. My pulse hammered, in my ears. Nothing. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe someone had found it already and was keeping it safe. Maybe, because what else could I tell myself? I slipped downstairs, clutching my empty purse close to my side, scanning the living room where a few family members lingered with coffee cups and sleepy smiles. My voice came out too light, too casual. Hey, did anyone happen to see an envelope? I think I misplaced it upstairs. Heads turned, faces blinked back at me, a few blank, a few mildly curious. Tom, sprawled out in an armchair with a smug ease that made my skin crawl, was the first to speak. Maybe it grew legs and walked off, he said, grinning wide, lifting his coffee mug in a mock toast. His laugh was too loud, too sharp, cutting, through the room like a knife. A few others chuckled along, more out of habit than humor. I stood there, frozen, feeling the heat rise up the back of my neck. I forced a smile, small and tight, and shrugged like it didn't matter. Like $3,000 wasn't just ripped out from under me in a place that should have been safe. No one looked twice. No one asked questions. The moment slid by, unnoticed by everyone except me, sinking deep into the pit of my chest like a stone. As the conversations drifted back to normal, weather, work, weekend plans, I gathered the scattered pieces of myself and quietly made my way to the door, my hands trembling slightly at my sides. Outside, the day was bright and cloudless, the air thick with the smell of cut grass. But something inside me had already turned cold. I lingered near the front door, purse clutched to my chest, heart pounding against the thin leather. For a long moment I hesitated, watching my family laugh and sip coffee as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath my feet. I swallowed the bitter taste rising in my throat and stepped back into the living room. I'm serious, I said, voice calm but tight. There was an envelope, cash, almost $3,000. They looked at me like I was speaking another language. Rachel frowned, setting her mug down with a soft clink. Are you sure you brought it? She asked, voice coated in the kind of concern that felt more like a blade than a balm. I opened my mouth, closed it again. Of course, I was sure. I had counted it twice before leaving home, tucked it carefully into the side pocket of my purse. I had even thought, briefly, that it was probably safer here than carrying it around town. The memory was vivid, sharp, immovable. Tom chuckled, the same condescending smirk playing on his lips. Maybe you lost it somewhere else. You've been busy lately, right? Easy to get distracted. A few heads nodded, slow and sympathetic, their faces soft with the kind of patronizing doubt reserved for people they no longer respected. I stood there, the weight of their disbelief crushing the last fragile thread of belonging I had clung to. It wasn't just the money that had been taken. It was trust. It was safety. It was the quiet, brutal realization that my presence here had become a courtesy, not a welcome. No big deal, Rachel added lightly, brushing invisible lint off her jeans. If you find it later, let us know. I smiled then, or something close to it. A sharp, small thing that barely touched my eyes. There was nothing left to say. No accusation that wouldn't be turned back against me. No proof that would make them see what they didn't want to see. I slipped on my jacket, the worn denim scratching against my arms. The front door creaked slightly as I opened it. Behind me, the murmur of conversation resumed, the door to the UBI family I'd spent my life defending closing quietly, almost mercifully. Outside, the sun was too bright, the sky too blue. I blinked against it, feeling the burn of unshed tears that I refused to let fall. Not here. Not for them. As I walked down the front steps, something inside me shifted. The hurt didn't dissolve or fade. It condensed, sharpened into something harder, something that would not break so easily the next time someone tried to steal from me. I didn't know what justice would look like yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not be standing still when it arrived. Back home, the silence wrapped around me like a second skin. The familiar creak of my front door, the soft thud of my purse dropping onto the entryway table. It all felt distant, muted. I moved on autopilot, slipping off my shoes, shrugging out of my jacket, each movement slow and careful, as if the wrong step might shatter me entirely. I sat at the kitchen table, head in my hands, willing the rush of anger and confusion to settle into something I could hold. $3,000. Gone. But it wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about being made to doubt myself. About the hollow looks, the laughter. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen lighting up, with smudged memories of the night before. At first, the photos seemed harmless. Blurry shots of kids with sparklers, plates of half-eaten food, Rachel leaning in too close to the camera, laughing. But then, halfway through a series of photos someone had snapped around dinner time, I saw it. There, almost blurred into the background, was Tom, my brother-in-law. Slipping quietly up the stairs, a beer in one hand, his other hand free and purposeful at his side. No one else on the staircase, no one noticing. The easy confidence of someone who believed he had the right. The breath caught in my throat. I zoomed in, studying the frame, the angle, the way his head ducked slightly as if avoiding attention. I could almost hear the soft thud of his footsteps on the carpeted stairs. Another memory floated up, unbidden. Me retrieving my purse at the end of the night, feeling, just for a second, that something was different. Lighter. I had brushed it off, distracted by the whirlwind of hugs and half-hearted goodbyes. But now, that fleeting feeling settled heavy in my gut. I stared at the photo until the screen dimmed and blacked out, my own reflection staring back at me. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't bad luck. It was a choice. A decision made in the span of a few minutes while everyone else was laughing and passing plates around a table. And now that choice lived in the background of a digital memory, captured without him even knowing it. The anger inside me cooled, sharpening into something clearer, steadier. They wanted me to doubt myself. They wanted me to walk away. Shoulders bowed, too ashamed to dig any deeper. Instead, I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, phone in hand, and made a silent promise to myself. I wasn't done, not even close. Long before the missing money, long before the forced smiles and hollow apologies, there were other silences, other moments that carved themselves quietly into the walls of my heart. Rachel was always the golden one. The first to walk, the first to charm a room, the first to bring home awards that my parents proudly framed on the living room wall. Her laughter filled spaces like sunlight, and I learned early on how to live in the long shadow she cast. When I was 7 and broke my arm falling off the swing set, I sat in the hospital waiting room, cradling my throbbing limb, while my parents fussed over Rachel's scraped knee from earlier that afternoon. I was patched up, of course, but without ceremony. No stickers, no lollipops, no grand retelling at the dinner table. Just a passing mention, an afterthought. It became a pattern. When I got into my first choice college, there was polite applause, followed quickly by a story about Rachel's latest promotion. When I landed my first real job, they asked if Rachel had heard back about her interview yet, eyes flickering away from my excitement like it was something embarrassing, something too small to matter. I learned to stop asking for attention. Learned to celebrate my own victories quietly, carefully, as if touching something too fragile. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their approval, that it was enough just to move forward, to build a life that didn't depend on applause. But that seed of wanting, of hoping, never really died. It just grew deeper, more hidden, like roots under frozen ground. The few times I tried to speak up about the imbalance, about how invisible I sometimes felt, the conversation would shift like smoke in the wind. "You're too sensitive," they'd say. Rachel didn't mean anything by it, and maybe she didn't. Maybe none of them did. Maybe it was just easier to believe that than to look too closely at the ways love could be measured, counted out in teaspoons instead of arms wide open. It was easier, too, to believe that starting my business would change everything. That success could rewrite old patterns. That showing up to the reunion with real accomplishments tucked under my belt would earn something more than polite nods and veiled jokes. But as I sat at the kitchen table, staring down at that blurry photo of Tom, slipping upstairs, the truth settled heavily into my bones. This wasn't the first betrayal, it was just the loudest. The one I couldn't explain away or bury under excuses. Some part of me had always known that love in our family was conditional, negotiable, weighted by invisible scales that never tipped in my favor. But knowing and accepting were two different things. Now there was no more room for pretending. Now there was only what was real. What had always been real, and I would not forget it again. I could have stormed back to that house. Could have shouted accusations across the same backyard where we had once played as children, demanded answers, demanded shame. But rage would have only given them something to point at, something to twist. I knew better now. I wasn't chasing apologies anymore. I was after something stronger, something quieter. That evening, I called Daniel, an old friend who had shifted from working in security to becoming a private investigator. We hadn't spoken in a while, but when he answered, there was no hesitation in his voice. No judgment, either. I didn't spill everything. I didn't have to. A few careful words, a slow exhale on the other end of the line, and he understood. We met the next morning at a small diner tucked between two closed antique shops, the kind of place where the booth still smelled faintly of syrup and old leather. I slid the photo across the table, the one from my phone. Tom halfway up the stairs, caught by accident, by carelessness. Daniel studied it in silence, his brow furrowing slightly. He asked a few questions. I answered them carefully, the facts, sharp and clean in my mouth, no embellishments, no emotion bleeding through. "You have enough," he said finally, tapping the photo with one blunt fingertip. "Maybe not for criminal charges, but civil, small claims court, you'd have a strong case." The words settled in my chest like a stone at the bottom of a still pond. Proof, action, consequences, delivered not in anger, but in quiet, steady certainty. Daniel outlined the steps, how the papers would be served, how public record would make the accusation linger long after the cash was forgotten. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about being seen. About drawing a hard, unflinching line where they had only ever drawn soft, disappearing ones. I left the diner with a manila folder tucked under my arm and a new weight in my step. Not the burden of betrayal, but the armor of knowing exactly what came next. Outside, the morning was brisk, the scent of rain lingering on the pavement, the wind tugging lightly at the edges of my jacket. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, sharp and clear. I breathed in deeply, letting the air fill my lungs, letting the cold sharpen the edges of my hurt into something more useful. This time, I wouldn't be talked down. I wouldn't be laughed off. I would let the truth do what it always eventually does: shine. I waited a full day before making my move. I wanted the dust to settle, the weekend to fade into routine, into that false sense of safety people wrap themselves in after wrongdoing. I wanted him relaxed, careless. On a Monday afternoon, I composed the message. It was short, polite, just casual enough to seem harmless. Hey everyone, just realized I might have misplaced an envelope upstairs during the reunion. If anyone happened to find it, let me know. Totally my fault if not. I read it 3 times. Before pressing send, my thumb hovering over the button like it was a trigger. Then, a soft buzz. The message slipped out into the family group chat, where birthday wishes and holiday photos usually lived. And I waited. The first replies trickled. Within minutes. A few quick, haven't seen anything messages. A couple of, hope you find it, with the careless breeziness of people who knew they had nothing to hide. Then Tom replied. His message was longer, defensive in a way that made my skin prickle. If you lost it, you must have lost it before you even got here. Nobody upstairs touched anything. We're not thieves, you know. No one else had mentioned upstairs. I hadn't even said where exactly I thought I left it. I stared at his words, feeling the shift in my chest. That undeniable click when a puzzle piece slides exactly into place. The lie was too heavy, too eager. It wasn't just denial. It was fear dressed up as anger. I forwarded the conversation to Daniel without comment. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone lit up with his reply. Proceed. He just told on himself. I leaned back in my chair, phone resting lightly against my knee, listening to the quiet hum of the fridge, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. The ordinary sounds of a world that kept turning, even as the ground beneath certain people was beginning to crack. I hadn't accused. I hadn't raged or pleaded or cried. I had offered them a door, and he had slammed it shut with his own trembling hands. Outside my window, the trees stirred gently in the afternoon breeze, their branches swaying in slow, deliberate arcs. I watched them for a while, feeling strangely steady. The trap was set. The teeth were hidden beneath soft grass and smiling words. And now all that was left was to wait for the final step, the moment when everything they thought they buried would come rushing back into the light. The sky was heavy with clouds as I pulled into their driveway, the kind that hung low and thick, promising rain but never quite delivering. I sat for a moment with the engine ticking softly beneath me, staring at the house that had once felt so familiar, so safe. The front door was open, laughter and clinking dishes spilling onto the porch like the scent of overripe roses, sweet but tinged with rot. I tucked a small package under my arm, a harmless excuse, something I claimed I'd borrowed during the reunion, and made my way up the steps. The wood creaked under my weight, just as it had when we were kids sneaking in past curfew. Tom was the first to see me. He lounged on the couch, one arm draped over the backrest, the other holding a sweating bottle of beer. His smirk bloomed the moment our eyes met, lazy and cruel. Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence, he said, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Rachel glanced up from the kitchen but quickly looked away, busying herself with a tray of drinks she didn't need to rearrange. I smiled softly, letting the words roll off me like rain on glass. Just dropping something off, I said, holding up the package like a peace offering. Tom leaned forward, setting his beer down with an exaggerated clunk. Lose anything else lately? He asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. At that exact moment, a firm knock sounded at the door behind me. 3 sharp raps, steady and professional. Tom frowned, thrown off balance by the timing. Rachel hesitated too, a wine glass pausing midair. I stepped aside as Daniel, dressed neatly in the navy polo and slacks of a courier service, stepped inside. He held out a thick envelope, his expression polite, detached. "Delivery for Tom," he said simply. Tom, still playing at being unfazed, swaggered over and snatched the envelope from Daniel's hand. He tore it open without even looking at the label, eager to maintain the upper hand. But the moment his eyes scanned the first few lines, small claims court, civil suit, petty theft, the color drained from his face like water swirling down a drain. For a moment, he just stood there, the pages trembling slightly in his grip. Rachel moved toward him instinctively, but he brushed her off, his bravado crumbling into something smaller, meaner. I met his eyes then, steady, unflinching. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, I just watched. He opened his mouth to speak, but whatever words he had been ready to unleash caught somewhere in his throat. The living room, once loud with easy laughter, sank into a thick, brittle silence. I turned without a word, stepping back onto the porch just as the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and cold against my skin. Behind me, the door swung shut, muffling the chaos that was only just beginning inside, and for the first time in a long, long while, I felt weightless. It didn't take long for the story to spread. At first, it was just a few awkward silences in the group chat. Plans that usually filled up with emoji-laced replies instead sat unread, a quiet weight pressing down between everyone. Then came the calls, not to me, but among themselves. Whispered questions, half-truths passed around like broken glass. Someone's cousin knew someone who worked at the courthouse. And soon enough, the details spilled into places they couldn't control. The proud image Rachel and Tom had built, the smiling photos at barbecues, the Facebook posts about family loyalty and hard work, started to crack. Hairline fractures. At first, then widening splits no amount of smiling could cover. People remembered things they'd laughed off before, jokes that had landed wrong, stories that didn't add up. The theft wasn't just a single act anymore. It became a symbol, a spotlight turned on all the smaller wrongs everyone had ignored for years. I said nothing. When Rachel finally texted me, a long, clumsy apology wrapped in excuses, I stared at it for a long time before setting my phone, face down on the table. Tom tried too, calling late one night, his number flashing across the screen like a dare. I let it ring until it went silent, until the apology he was too proud to leave in a voicemail evaporated into nothing. There was dignity in my silence. More power in the spaces I refused to fill. In public, they pretended nothing had happened, but the air around them shifted. You could see it in the way people spoke to them now, a politeness edged with distance. You could hear it in the way laughter around them grew tight and uncertain, like everyone was waiting for a shoe that had already dropped. I walked through it all untouched, not with glee, not with triumph, but with a kind of quiet relief. The battle was over before they even realized it had begun. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't begged for justice. I had simply held a mirror up to their faces and let them destroy themselves. Sometimes the loudest statement you can make is to say nothing at all. And as I moved through the days that followed, grocery store lines, emails, passing conversations, I carried myself a little differently. Shoulders back, chin up. The girl who once begged for scraps of approval had vanished, leaving behind someone stronger, someone who had finally learned that dignity, once reclaimed, is not something you ever have to ask for again. The rain started sometime after midnight, a soft, steady rhythm against the windows of my new apartment. I sat curled up in the armchair by the balcony, a blanket thrown over my legs, the room lit only by the occasional flicker of passing headlights. Everything smelled faintly of fresh paint and wet earth, the scent of something ending and something just beginning. Outside, the city blurred at the edges, buildings softened by mist, streetlights bleeding gold into puddles on the sidewalk. I watched the water slide down the glass, tracing slow, meandering paths like tiny rivers finding their way home. It wasn't the kind of rain that demanded attention, loud and violent. It was quieter than that, patient. The kind of rain that soaks into the soil unnoticed until you realize the ground has changed beneath your feet. I thought about the last few weeks, the laughter that had died in their throats, the hollow apologies, the shifting eyes at family gatherings I no longer attended. I thought about how easily the truth had unraveled them when they had spent years pretending it wasn't even there. Justice had come, clean and sharp, but it hadn't erased the betrayal. It hadn't stitched the old wounds closed or erased the memories of being the afterthought, the background noise to someone else's spotlight. Some things, I realized, were not meant to be fixed. Some doors, once closed, stayed closed for a reason. And maybe that was a kind of freedom, too. I wrapped the blanket tighter around myself, feeling the quiet strength in my own bones, the steady beat of my own heart, unshaken now by anyone else's. Approval or disappointment, I didn't need them to see me anymore. I didn't need them to clap or nod or apologize in the half-hearted way that always left me emptier than before. I had seen myself. I had stood when it would have been easier to fold. I had chosen dignity over desperation, truth over comfort. And in that choice, I had found something no betrayal could take from me. Outside, the rain deepened, a soft roar against the world, washing everything clean. I let my head fall back against the chair, breathing in the dampness, the quiet, the peace, letting the storm outside mirror the storm I had walked through and left behind. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the calm, unshakable certainty that I was still standing, that I had saved myself, and that was more than enough.